Before I start the message, I'd like to share the Bible reading. I'd like to base part of what I'm going to say on. And it's a reading we traditionally hear on the first Sunday of Advent. It's taken from the prophecy of Isaiah, chapter 9, starting to read at verse 6. For a child has been born for us, a son given to us. Authority rests upon his shoulders, and he is named Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. His authority shall continually grow, and there shall be endless peace for the throne of David and his kingdom. He will establish it and uphold it with justice and righteousness from this time onward and forevermore. Amen. A very ancient philosopher, and I can't remember who it was, once said, "Hope is often the only thing separating one from the abyss." That's a pretty heavy statement, but it points to a pretty heavy truth, that one can survive and persevere through almost anything if one has hope. But without hope, without a belief that things will get better, that problems can be resolved, that solutions can be found, that new beginnings are possible, there is little to keep us from a dark, cavernous abyss of despair. I've been a minister for 25 years, which means that I've been a minister through 25 Advent seasons, which means that I have preached on the first Sunday of 25 Advent seasons a sermon on the topic of hope. And I'll admit, this is the first one where I can honestly say, wow, is this ever a topic that we need to reflect on? This is the first one where I think we have been collectively as close to that abyss as we ever want to be, at least in my lifetime. That doesn't mean to say there haven't been years when maybe you personally needed to hear a message of hope this Sunday, because I know there have been. But as a congregation, as a community, and as a global community, this is a time when we need to hear words of hope. We need to feel the encouragement of our faith, and we need to be invited back from the edge of the abyss. It's been a heck of a journey these past few months. And I'd like to think that every preacher in every pulpit, in every church, in every country this morning is holding up and holding out words of hope. And I will be too. But before I get to that, let's just take stock for a moment. So, if hope were a scale between 1 and 10, with 1 being the abyss of despair, and 10 being overflowing with optimism, where would you locate yourself right now on that hope scale between 1 and 10? Well, unless you're a shareholder with Pfizer, I doubt that there are any 10s among us. And I dearly hope that there are no 1s among us as either, although I'm certainly not going to discount that possibility. There are people really, really struggling right now, and I hope if you're one of them that you will always reach out. My guess is that many of us are probably hovering around the middle of that scale. On a good day, maybe we're a 6 or a 7. On a not so good day, maybe a 3 or a 4. And maybe it's always fluctuating. You know, one day you're Zooming or FaceTiming with your friends and family, feeling connected in and feeling positive. The next, you're curled up on the couch, weeping your way through a Hallmark Christmas movie, wondering if things are ever going to be the same again. And I'm right there with you. Good days and not so good days. But I will be honest that when I heard the good news about the vaccines a couple weeks ago, my hope number jumped at least a couple of points. And it's pretty much stayed there. I think I went from a 5 up to about a 7, because finally it appears that there is an end coming to this situation. Again, hope is born when we can see a solution to a problem. You know, I think of this entire thing, these last 9 months, as kind of like a maze. Last March, we entered a maze, and for months now we've been wandering around, bumping into dead ends, retracing our steps, wondering where our friends went, scratching our heads, wondering how we ever got here in the first place. And now it finally seems that someone is on their way to take us by the hand and lead us to the exit. And we can start to plan the wonderful get-togethers that will come again soon. Oh, the friends we will see, and the hugs we will give, and the places we will go, and the parties we will have, and the churches we will return to. You are coming back, I hope. But we can finally, cautiously, and optimistically start to plan for our post-COVID lives whenever we finally are able to leave this maze. It's going to be wonderful. When I heard that there are vaccines on the way, I felt like going into the streets and proclaiming, "The end is nigh." But when a minister proclaims such things, it could easily be misinterpreted. But the end of this does seem to be nigh. So I hope you too have been buoyed by that news and buoyed by the hope that comes with it. And it's allowed you to take a couple of steps back from that horrible abyss of despair. But, as we all know, despite the good news and despite that boost of hope, it doesn't mean that we're all getting vaccines wrapped and put under our tree for Christmas. We know that getting to the end of this is not going to be a sprint. It's going to be a much longer race. It's going to take time, and we know that in the short term, we have a Christmas to get through. We have a long Canadian winter to get through. The hope on the horizon is amazing, and I invite you to fix your eyes to that hope. But it still doesn't replace the courage and the resiliency and the patience that we need now and for the coming weeks and months before we finally get out of this maze. So, even if we are holding in our hearts hope for the future, we still need some kind of hope, some good news for today. So let's talk about that. What I want to do today is share with you 3 voices of hope that might have something to say to us about getting through these difficult times. The first is the voice of an ancient prophet. The second is a voice of a modern-day psychologist. And if prophets and psychologists aren't really your thing, maybe you'll like the third voice. It is of a beloved cartoon character. Maybe they all have something to say to us about hope. By the way, before we begin, I'd like to share with you one of my very favorite quotes about hope. The poet Georges Herbert once said this: "One who lives with hope is one who can dance without music." It's a good one. I invite you to write that up and put it up on your fridge. One who lives with hope is one who can dance without music. So, the first voice of hope I want to lift up today is the voice of the prophet Isaiah. His words of prophecy, written so very long ago, usually appear, as I said, on the first Sunday of Advent. Peering into some unknown future, he wrote, "One day a child will be born for you. He will hold the authority of the world upon his shoulders. And he will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, and Prince of Peace." We read these words on the first Sunday of Advent because we assume he was predicting the birth of Jesus one day. Whether he was or not, we don't really know. But he was telling his people not to lose faith, not to lose heart, for in the fullness of time, something new was coming. Sometimes we assume that the job of a prophet is to predict the future. It's actually not. The job of the prophet was to remind people that there is a future. The job of the prophet is to tell people not to get so bogged down in the quicksand of today's problems that you stop believing in tomorrow's solutions. The prophet was the person encouraging others to lift their heads, to prepare their hearts, to get their lives in order, to hold tightly to their faith, and to trust that tomorrow can be a better day, even if tomorrow is many tomorrows in the future. There's new life out there, he's saying. Wait for it, watch for it, and believe in it. Remember when you were a kid and you would open that first door of your Advent calendar on December the 1st? Remember how you felt? Christmas is never going to get here. And you would look at all those unopened doors and you think to yourself, it's never going to happen. And yet, every year, it did. And with every open door, that expectation, that anticipation, and that hope would grow. Whether it's Isaiah telling his people to believe in the future, or the angel Gabriel telling Mary to be patient, for in 9 months she would give birth to a special child. Prophetic voices are hopeful voices, pointing us towards the future. They encourage us to keep our faith in dark times, to be patient while waiting, to keep the pilot light of hope burning within, and to believe that there is going to be a future, and we don't want to miss it. Someone said this, and I think this is actually quite brilliant. Hope is the ability to see your life as a progression. That's actually very wise. If we think of our life as always progressing, not just towards something, but actually into something, then everything, good, bad, challenging, difficult, beautiful, is part of our progression as people and contains the lessons and the wisdom we need to get to that next stage of our life, to get ourselves into the future. The point is, I have no doubt, that if Isaiah were here today, he would tell us to hang in there, to keep opening those doors on the calendar, even if that goal seems very far away. He would invite us to stay strong, to stay resilient, for there is a future, and that future is coming. There's a line of Sanskrit poetry that goes like this: listen to the exhortation of the dawn. Every yesterday is a dream of happiness, and every tomorrow is a vision of hope. The second voice of hope is much more contemporary. It belongs to a man named Dr. Dale Archer. Dr. Archer is a clinical psychologist. He knows all about getting through difficult times. He works with people who have suffered trauma in their life. In fact, his claim to fame was that he was the lead clinical psychologist who treated survivors from Hurricane Katrina and Hurricane Rita, people who'd lost everything, including often their peace of mind. And he came to the conclusion that there are two types of people when it comes to dealing or getting over traumatic events. He called them psychological survivors and psychological victims. And he discovered that which category you fell into had nothing to do with your level of wealth, education, how much you may have lost in a traumatic event. It really was the level of hope that you carried, the belief in yourself and others that you can and will survive this, and that you will get better. Listen to how he describes the two categories. A psychological victim, he says, tends to be passive, pessimistic, and looks to the past. They ask, who will help me? They despair and are all consumed by what they've lost, and often refuse to do anything that can help themselves. A psychological survivor, on the other hand, he described this way. These folks are active, optimistic, and look to the future. They ask, how can I help myself? They grieve, which is healthy, but they continue to persevere and to fight. And he concluded that his work was to try to help psychological victims become psychological survivors. He discovered in this process that there are three components that you really need to have to move from being a victim to a survivor. Three qualities he noticed in people that he felt were a must. I wonder if you could guess what they are. Number one was faith. People who tended to fare best through traumatic events, he said, had a faith. But listen to how he describes that word. Faith is the belief that there is something bigger and more important than you, whether it's God, a higher power, a child, a loved one, a mission, a cause. It gives you a reason to go on, to keep fighting, to keep hanging in there. The second quality, he said, is hope. Survivors, he said, don't get marred down in what has happened, but are always looking at how they can move beyond what has happened. He said, believe it or not, there were people who lost everything in Hurricane Katrina, and he said we're still optimistic about the future. He said it was because they refused to be defined by the worst moment of their life. As one man said to him, So long as there is breath in my body and hope in my heart, there is a reason to feel good about the future. And finally, the third quality, he said, is love. He said, while psychological victims tend to disappear into their own shell, survivors do exactly the opposite. They come out of their shell. They are aware of those who are offering a hand of help and care, and they will readily accept that hand. He said they're also more willing to ask for help. They allow themselves to be loved, and they in turn keep extending love to others. So did you catch something in that? Dale Archer isn't a minister. In fact, I don't even think he's a religious person. But he just quoted Scripture, probably without knowing he was doing it. 1 Corinthians 13 says this, now faith, hope, and love abide, these three, and the greatest of these is love. Faith, hope, and love. Out of the ruins of catastrophe, this psychologist discovered that the key to surviving and moving forward in traumatic times means nurturing a faith in something bigger than you, keeping hope for the future, and accepting and giving love. The last voice that we're going to hear from is, as I said, from a beloved cartoon character, and that is Charlie Brown. I invited everyone this past week to hang an ornament, a red ornament of hope somewhere. And for those in the service, we saw pictures of those ornaments all over Barrie and beyond. It wasn't my idea. I got it from Deb Hunt, a member of our church. And you know what? It wasn't Deb Hunt's idea either. I mean, the execution of it was. But she got the idea from Charlie Brown. Now, I don't want to assume that everyone has seen the Charlie Brown Christmas special, so let me just share it in a nutshell. Charlie Brown is, of course, the boy who never seems to get things right. He's always on the fringe of his friends group, often ridiculed or put down. His friends decide they want to put on a Christmas play, and Charlie Brown is given the job of finding a Christmas tree to decorate the hall. So he and his pal Linus venture out. They see every kind of fancy tree you can imagine. But finally he comes across this rather small, pathetic-looking tree. Stripped of almost everything, it just has basic brown, some green branches. Perhaps he sees himself in that tree. So he buys it, and he brings it to the hall. And of course, all his friends get upset with him for his poor choice of a tree. Poor Charlie Brown. Fast forward a little bit. After Linus reminds them all of the real meaning of Christmas, Charlie Brown takes a red ornament and he hangs it on his tree. It's a magical moment that seems to change everybody's perspective. His friends decide, maybe it's not such a bad tree after all. And they all get together and they decorate it up. It's a classic Christmas story of what? Of hope. Sometimes we think of hope as something that comes to us. But what if it is also something that comes from us? Hope is the patching of something that is broken. Hope is adding beauty to something that's lost its shine. Hope is bringing value to something that is otherwise mundane. Hope is adding a single red ball to a sad and sidelined little tree. I've heard a lot of people suggest that this is going to be a, quote, COVID Christmas. What a horrible way to define Christmas. I don't want to put those two words together, even though I understand why people are saying that. I understand the meaning behind it. But what instead if we thought of this not as a COVID Christmas, but as a Charlie Brown Christmas? Like that little tree, so bare and barren. Much of what Christmas has been in the past may have changed for us this year. Some of its color, its traditions, its familiarity may have been taken away temporarily. And maybe Christmas is kind of stripped bare from what it's been in the past. So what if the hope of Christmas pivots this year from something that we receive from it to something we bring to it. In this month's edition of Broadview Magazine, which is our United Church of Canada magazine, Reverend Dr. Richard Bott, our moderator, invites us to go deeply into the Christmas story this year. He says that we have an opportunity to reflect on what this story really means. It was not a story of perfection. It was not actually a story of happiness. But it was a story of the persistence of light, of the birth of hope in a tiny, forgotten corner of the world. A reminder that where there is light, there is God. And where there is God, there is the promise of something new. When we can grasp that meaning in the depths of our being, then maybe we can find a way to be hope, to let the light of God's love shine through us into dark corners. Our moderator put it this way: the Christmas story is a song of hope. This Christmas, could we let that song lead us into new ways of understanding who we are called to be? I've told this story many times, but again, this year it just has so much more meaning. During the 1800s, in the middle of the American Civil War, a poet called Longfellow was alone in his small